The election is over, and Democrat presumptive president-elect Joe Biden is claiming victory, discussing his plans to correct the failures of the current public health crisis by the former administration. He hopes to succeed, which he claims had caused unacceptable economic losses as well as proclaiming the lives of many Americans. And while even the governor of Virginia for weeks had been encouraging voters to do their duty, get out and vote, now, with the arrival of the holidays, he is even discouraging families from getting together for the holidays. A traditional practice for many families who, like the losses of grandparents before even Easter and Mother's Day this year, remain at the highest risk and may not be around to celebrate with the family next year, or whenever a pandemic that has baffled even scientists will ever be brought under control. Just prior to the election, Ralph Northam announced the good news that even though infections were rising in 42 other states, especially in the battleground states, Virginia appeared to be unaffected. And congratulating Virginians for the success, Dr. Ralph Northam quizzically offered the reason that he guessed the state just got lucky. But any crisis manager knows that hope is not a plan, and relying on luck is not a success story. But that did not prevent at least 1 million people rushing to polling places to engage in their opportunity for early voting in the 2 weeks prior to Halloween in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So it should not be surprising that just days ago, according to the Washington Times, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam on Friday announced that he is reducing the number of people allowed at gatherings, among other coronavirus restrictions, because of a surge of cases in the state. Beginning Sunday at midnight, all gatherings indoors and outdoors must be limited to 25 people, a drop from the current cap of 250 people, which affects all places of worship with large congregations that had been permitted to return to in-person worship upon the beginning of phase 3, as well as may also adversely impact classroom school instruction for your children. In addition, now all residents ages 5 and older are now required to wear face coverings indoors. The current mask requirement, which was put in place on May 29th, only mandated that all individuals age 10 and over wear a face mask. The new restrictions have also banned the sale of all alcohol after 10 p.m. from any food establishment, brewery, distillery, or winery, and all restaurants and alcohol venues must close by midnight. While in any public health crisis, when a surge of infections from a potentially lethal pathogen arises, it is important to do something. It is also far more imperative to do the right thing to prevent infection. And things are not always as they appear, especially during a crisis when human psychology may cause unexperienced leaders, even scientists, to be overcome, fixated upon their feelings and not focused upon the facts, as we are often trained and experienced doing in the military. Problems that arise for many leaders in business are often solved by consultants who bring fresh eyes to the problem, and many are trained and credentialed with the certification of a completion of a Six Sigma process management course, just as I earned at Villanova University. In addition, like no other candidate for governor of Virginia, I possess 2 decades of force protection experience, have served as a security officer for infantry and tank battalions, am certified in composite risk assessment, as well as military decision-making, as a military education level 3 qualified officer, field grade. And since college, in multiple environments, both in the civilian sector and in the military, have become very experienced in crisis management, having served as the Ground Zero crisis manager during a financial crisis at a major New York City bank, amounting to over $500 million immediately after my college graduation, which I, using basic risk management principles, managed to resolve in only 1 year. As a lieutenant, I not only assumed command of a logistics section that had lost all property accountability, resulting in the relief from command of more senior officers than I for the prior 3 consecutive years. And in just 1 year, I managed to attain a commendable inspection rating, restoring accountability, despite having little or no experience, especially in logistics. And shortly before that, had stood up a 24-hour strategic counterintelligence operations cell for the entire United States Army in response to the Oklahoma City bombing, an event of national significance. And 1 year later, did the same in response to the pipe bombing at the Atlanta Olympics, because of the faith and trust that my command had in my skill, despite no prior experience in that novel contingency, because things generally don't blow up every day and have a lieutenant have the opportunity to solve the problem. This was only possible because rather than looking at each problem as a unique crisis, I examined each crisis according to well-established and systematic crisis management processes, which always begins first with defining in very specific terms what actually needs to be addressed. What exactly is the problem? A plan to prevent anything requires in-depth knowledge about the thing you are required to prevent, something we call in the military intelligence. And woefully, even the nation's only physician serving as a state governor, nor even the esteemed Dr. Fauci, has ever to date done that first required task. Some examples of my success using basic empirical methods, rather than relying upon emotions during the current pandemic crisis, include predicting that the millions of projected dead on the continent of Africa that had been projected by the World Health Organization in February would occur. And in only recent months, have they reported in their confirmation of my assessment, because the mass fatalities never materialized. Just as I had been able to announce the cause of the downed airliner in Tehran back in January, over 6 hours before even the Wall Street Journal and the British broadcast system, without even the aid of satellite imagery upon which they relied for their conclusion. We brought suit in March against the governor, State Department of Health, State Health Commissioner Muhammad Norman Oliver, the City of Alexandria, and Mayor Justin Wilson, seeking to compel them to adopt measures to protect the elderly in nursing homes in the event that it could be validated that COVID-19 was in fact a highly infectious disease. And while Governor Ralph Northam and all of the state agency defendants decided to evade a summons from the Alexandria City Sheriff in obstruction of justice, a felony punishable by fine and up to 20 years in prison, Mayor Wilson and the City of Alexandria moved to dismiss the litigation on grounds that the risk to the elderly and our other claims were not even a justiciable issue, a ruling handed down on the day after the primary elections in June, despite evidence in the press just a month before that over half of the fatalities, as I had predicted in the Commonwealth, were the elderly in nursing homes that our litigation sought to protect. Those deaths are not because of anything that I failed to do. Around the time of the arrival of the novel coronavirus in the United States in January, a series of articles began to appear on the topic of selection bias, using the example of British bombers during World War II, that the military decided to retrofit with more armor to protect the planes and troops inside. Noting the aircraft that had returned, they reviewed the battle damage that could be observed and first adopted a plan to increase the thickness of the armor in the places where they saw the most battle damage from enemy fire on the fuselage of the plane. And those who believed the article was intriguing to them as a novel discovery began to repost their discovery on multiple social media and networking platforms, and most believed that they would not have made the same mistakes that the British Air Force did during World War II. By not noticing that if bombers had survived the battle damage that could be observed on the returning aircraft, those were probably the least in need of protection because the damage had been sustained did not prevent the damaged aircraft to actually return to its home base. So the dispositive question, as the Commonwealth begins to lock down again, is what is the potential for success of this plan to go back into lockdown? One has only to look at the success of the initial lockdown, which required multiple refinements that eventually resulted in a stay-at-home order, but which still, by the end of May, found 85 days after the novel coronavirus appeared in the Washington region, the number of known infections in the national capital region surpassing 100,000, meaning 6 in every 1,000 residents, and with at least 13,000 patients hospitalized and 4,239 fatalities, according to the Washington Post. On the first day of the lockdown, there were less than 100 fatalities in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And by the beginning of phase 2, we had over 4,000. For most Virginians, while primarily Democrat Party municipalities in Northern Virginia, such as the County of Arlington, Fairfax County, and the City of Alexandria, requested an extension because the region with one of the largest populations of government scientists, as well as a very high incidence of persons engaged in public health professions, were finding the most difficulty in the state gaining control on the infections, just looking at metrics regarding numbers of infections, numbers of fatalities, which told them nothing at all about how to prevent them, but claimed that they were required more time because it was they and not others who were using the science. It is a fact that on February 24th, the World Health Organization report on their review of over 55,000 laboratory-confirmed cases told every nation in the world not to resort to the draconian measures that had been adopted primarily in Wuhan, because those measures, it was claimed by the Chinese government, were designed to save the world, which obviously did not happen, and contained the novel coronavirus that today finds the United States as the world leader in infections, hospitalizations, and fatalities. At which time, of that report, in an interview on March 2nd, the leading epidemiologist for that extensive study, the Assistant Deputy Director for the World Health Organization, stated that he did not know why governments were worldwide apparently following the advice of Dr. Fauci, locking down their economies in response to a pathogen for which not even one scientist had determined the level of infectious dose, an essential requirement for adopting an effective prevention plan, and for which they could not conclude, the World Health Organization could not conclude was an infectious disease, communicable from person to person, especially since their review of trace contacts, another primary task, from over 55,000 laboratory-confirmed cases in China, failed to find even a 5% secondary attack rate, indicative that some other cause was responsible for its rapid migration. although they did not speculate at the time what that might be, only stating that more study might be required. In early April, one naval officer, according to multiple press accounts, made the bold decision to risk his career to save the lives of his men by violating his chain of command and, at least in gross negligence, leaking information to the press. Provided the best example of the effectiveness of lockdowns against this particular novel coronavirus by quarantining over 4,000 sailors in private hotel rooms on the island of Guam, while permitting the remaining sailors to remain aboard the aircraft carrier that had been in port on the territorial island of Guam. Notwithstanding other constitutional concerns, the result of that containment strategy, just aboard the cruise ship Diamond Princess, which he had used for his example, his scientific example for compliant quarantine facilities, failed to break the chain of infection, finding a total of 155 laboratory-confirmed cases on April 2nd, rise to 1,417 before the sailors were released from quarantine and set sail from Guam on June 5th. In this incident, according to the U.S. Navy records, there were also several instances of reinfection, despite what some studies have projected, that based upon serological samples obtained from 323 volunteers, at least 2/3 of the 4,574 sailors aboard a ship that can accommodate berthing 5,680 shipboard company and flight deck personnel. Simply these findings regarding the reinfections in less than 3 months raise serious questions despite current claims regarding the effectiveness of a vaccine solution, because they rely upon the building of antibodies to prevent reinfection or infection. Similarly, on the island of Guam, that had begun its COVID-19 response with even stricter measures than has yet been used by any stateside governor to date. In early March, before the arrival of the aircraft carrier, found 27 cases and 1 death. By September, climbed to over 5,000 cases on an island of only 166,000 people. The only Pacific island upon which COVID-19 has to date taken hold with such devastating effects, and also the former forward deployed operating base for the nation's strategic bomber force in the Sino-Pacific, which were relocated stateside on April 17th. Accordingly, on one small island, roughly 20 times the size of the nation's capital, the strictest lockdowns upon empirical record failed woefully in preventing infections, which should reasonably indicate that there is something wrong with the plan Governor Northam and other Democrat governors have re-implemented, and which the presumptive President-elect Joe Biden has endorsed as a national policy and priority in his presumptive coming administration. According to the science, the only way that any pathogen with a less than 20% attack rate can result in mass infections in an outbreak is for a sufficient quantity of pathogen to be introduced into a person's breathable air, achieving saturated suspension of aerosol particles, which, because of their size, may persist in a cloud for up to 2 hours. As a former biological warfare planner who of record actually helped to launch the intelligence organization that reporters from ABC News had claimed had alerted the president, I am not aware of any natural means by which that result might be achieved, and specifically requested an answer from Lindsay C. Marr, a professor at Virginia Tech University, and who is one of the 239 scientists who have petitioned the World Health Organization upon their final discovery in June to attempt to persuade that public health authority that COVID-19 was not being primarily transmitted by droplets being passed from person to person in exhalation events such as coughing, sneezing, talking, or even singing, but rather was being transmitted as an aerosol. And it is of at least probative value that despite accepting multiple interviews for the New York Times, she has yet to date to respond to this inquiry, which should be reasonable cause for suspicion, sufficient for examination by a grand jury, that we are requesting from the Fourth Circuit on claims arising from the COVID-19 response in Virginia to be convened by the Federal District Court in Richmond. This is very little evidence, especially with regard to any pathogen being transmitted as an aerosol, that the substitute for medical-grade personal protective equipment will save your life, nor the life of anyone else. And with the current intent to now begin prioritized distribution of vaccines untested for long-term effects, as well as the recently imposed restrictions, returning Virginia to the circumstances that had immediately resulted in a tenfold rise in unemployment and closing of churches, as an informed voter, it may be said to be your duty, probably more than voting on election day for your favorite candidate, because it is not just democracy at stake, but your life and health, to ask what a reasonable person would do under these circumstances. Remember, you are no longer a child in school, and with schools closed, neither are your children. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for governor of Virginia. I ask every Christian, every conservative, every Republican, every Virginian, and every American to, like the motto of the infantry, follow me, and we shall overcome. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.